Welcome back, everyone. I'm happy to be here introducing Alex Cho and Aaron Gomperts, who will be talking to us about basics of bird photography. Before I introduce them, I wanted to make a couple of comments. First of all, I'm sure that all of you have noticed that we've had many youth presenters at the conference already and more to come, as well as our grant recipients. And on behalf of the Student Programs Committee and the Board of WFO, want to thank the members for supporting all of our student programs. Your support is critical to us, and we appreciate it very much. Secondly, given the topic, I should mention that we've just had our first bird photography contest at WFO, and the results of that contest are posted on the WFO website. If you go to the home page, there's a tab there and you can see the winning entries. We'll say a little bit more about that at the members meeting later on. Well, today I'm happy to reintroduce Alex Cho. Some of you will have heard his presentation with John Dunn on the Tule goose earlier in the day. Alex is a young birder originally from Southern California and now living in the Bay Area. He began birding at the age of 8 and quickly moved into doing community science projects. As I mentioned before, the Heron and Egret Project, Bluebird Recovery Project, and other studies, and has become interested in the Tule goose. He's an avid photographer and a member of the North American Nature Photography Association. Both Alex and Aaron are members of the Los Angeles Birders student group and members of WFO. Aaron is also a passionate birder who began at a young age, the age of 7, and he has been banding birds in Zuma Canyon for 3 years. Recently, his photographs have become recognized in competitions. He won the backyard bird section of the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory World Migratory Bird Day photo contest. And he has another entry in a young bird photographer of the year contest. So without further ado, I'll introduce Alex and Aaron to talk to us about basics of bird photography. Thank you.
Thank you. So, welcome everyone. I'm Alex, and today we will be talking about the basics of bird photography. Aaron?
Yes, and I'm Aaron. Welcome to the presentation.
So here are our objectives for today. Our objectives will be selecting the right equipment, determining good settings, implementing good field techniques, establishing boundaries for ethical photography, creating an interesting or pleasing image, and enhancing and possibly saving photos through post-processing. We hope by the end of this presentation, you will be able to apply these tips to your photography.
So the right equipment, we're going to be talking a bit about cameras and how to choose them. I took this photo with my Canon 7D Mark II with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens.
Starting off, we will be talking about cameras. There are 4 basic types of cameras, and they're all good for bird photography. It's important to know their differences because there are differences between the different types, and there's a wide selection available for each of the 4 basic types. This photo of a black-throated sparrow I took with a Nikon D500 DSLR with a Nikon Nikkor 200 to 500 millimeter lens. With the camera, I was able to adjust my settings because it was a cloudy day.
So the different types of cameras. Cameras can be largely split into 4 different categories. The first is point and shoot. These are usually the cheapest, the smallest, and the most compact. They won't give you as much manual control over your settings or as much zoom, but they're definitely a viable option. The next step up from that would be bridge cameras. Bridge just meaning that they have the lens is fixed to the camera. These often offer some manual control, and they're usually a lot lighter than other cameras, but they often offer some of the most zoom power. DSLRs are interchangeable lens cameras, so you buy the body and the lens separately. These give you a lot of control over settings and are some of the most popular cameras. Mirrorless cameras are similar to DSLRs, but use an electronic viewfinder. They are kind of a new technology for bird photography, and they can be a lot better in some ways, but often a lot more expensive. I highly recommend doing your own research because this is a complicated field.
And here are some examples that any camera will work for bird photography. This yellow-rumped warbler photo I took with a Nikon Coolpix P900, which is a bridge camera and a camera that is very popular among birders. And I was able to get this photo. With a point and shoot camera, this photo of a Dixisol was taken, and you can see that it's a good photo as well. Continuing on with this, these two photos were shot with a Canon R5, which is a mirrorless camera, and these are fantastic photos. So these examples just go to show that any camera will work for bird photography.
So camera lenses. If you're purchasing an interchangeable lens camera like a mirrorless or a DSLR, then it's important to get a good lens. The lens is more important than the body. The lens is really what creates the image. And choosing it, you'll want a focal length for bird photography of at least 300 millimeters. Try and get a lens with a smaller f-stop number, and then lenses can generally be grouped into two categories: prime lenses and zoom lenses. Zoom lenses are often a lot more versatile and a lot cheaper, whereas prime lenses are often bigger and heavier, but also sharper and let in more light.
And here's where if you find yourself without a camera and you want to photograph a bird. Phones have good cameras, and the practice of putting your phone up to the lens of your binoculars or your scope is called digibirding. It can take practice because it can be a little bit tricky, but there are attachments for your binoculars or your scope that hook directly up to your phone, and those can help. It's good for when you don't have a camera on you, and digiscoping can be good for long distance photos, even if you do have a camera on you. Sometimes the scope will have better reach than the actual camera. And with digiscoping, you can take videos with your phone. Here are two examples of digibirding. I took these two photos, and they're not excellent photos, but they're good for documentation. This snowy egret I took with my camera up to my binoculars, and it was a little bit difficult to get because there was a little bit of shake involved with the camera and my binoculars, and it can be difficult to line them up. Whereas with these pelicans and shorebirds, I was able to put my phone up to my scope and take this photo, and that's a little bit easier because your scope is typically mounted on a tripod, which can help with lining up your phone to the opening of the lens.
So you'll probably want to consider some additional gear. Extra batteries and memory cards are important. And then also protecting your camera against the elements. Lens hoods and lens filters are good for this. If it's going to be raining, then a rain sleeve is often important. Also, especially if you have a heavier camera, it's important to get a comfortable camera strap.
So now we will be talking about camera settings. For this photo of a violet-crowned hummingbird, I adjusted my settings because I only wanted the bird in focus and nothing else. So my settings, as seen here, I adjusted to get only him in focus, which worked.
So we're going to go over determining settings with some terms, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and how these three settings form the triangle of settings, and then also focus and autofocus. So ISO is a setting that will brighten or darken your photo. It's essentially the sensitivity of the camera's sensor to light. Um, so using a higher ISO number will mean a more sensitive sensor, and you'll be able to shoot in lower lighting conditions. However, as you increase your ISO, you'll also introduce noise or grain into the photo. So f-stop or aperture is the opening in the lens. So a lower number is indicative of a wider opening, which can be a bit confusing. Uh, so using a lower f-stop number will let more light onto your sensor, allow you to shoot in lower light, but it also affects the depth of field, which is basically how much of your image is in focus. So using a low f-stop number will allow you to have a smaller depth of field and therefore more background and foreground blur in your image.
And now I'll talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is how fast your camera takes a photo. And when photographing birds, a faster shutter speed is usually better unless you're going for an effect, because that means there will be no motion blur. There is a lighting trade-off, however, because it's how fast your camera is taking a photo, which means that the faster shutter speed you have, the less light you're going to let into your camera, which means that the photo you take will be darker. Here you can see that I took this photo of a Rivoli's hummingbird at 1 out of 32 hundredths of a second shutter speed. And with this high shutter speed, I was able to freeze him in the frame. Aaron took this photo of an Allen's hummingbird at 1/500th of a second, and the hummingbird itself is frozen in the frame, but because of the lower shutter speed, the wings are blurred, creating for an interesting effect. And this waterfall was taken by photographer Jim Smith with a shutter speed of 1.6 seconds long. So with 1.6 seconds, that's over a whole second that the camera takes a photo. And as water moves quite fast, there's a lot of motion blur. So it resulted in this really cool, soft, silky-like effect on the water. Next, we'll talk about the triangle of camera settings. So this is the triangle of how the settings all work in harmony with each other. You can see by this graphic that it shows each of the settings and how they affect one another. So with shutter speed, as we mentioned, low shutter speed with a moving target, you're going to get motion blur. With a high shutter speed, you're going to freeze the target in the frame, but there is going to be a brightness penalty. With ISO, there's with a low ISO, there's going to be a nice, crisp, clean photo. But with high ISO, you'll make the photo brighter, but at the same time, introduce a lot of noise into your photo. And with aperture, with the low F number, as we mentioned, and it is confusing, with the low F number, the opening of the lens will be wider, whereas with a high f-stop number, the opening will be small, so that this high f-stop number lets more light in, which creates less bokeh, but it can also create some darkness in the photo somehow. And with a low f number, that introduces more bokeh into the photo, but brightens it. And so it's really just a balance of these settings and how they work together to create a good photo.
So some examples of how these can be used. In the photo of the willets, you can see I used a really low shutter speed of only 1/60th of a second. And because I was panning along with these birds, the birds are fairly sharp, but the water behind them has this kind of blurry, streaky effect to it, and the wings are also a bit blurred. Um, and I was able to use a low ISO of 100 because I was letting so much light in with my low shutter speed. Um, with this image of a Forster's tern, uh, I wanted to freeze the bird. I didn't want them to be any blur, so I used a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. However, this forced me to push up my ISO to 1600, so there is some grain in the image.
And in these two examples of the triangle, with this flock of elegant terns I took, they were all in a pretty large flock. So I went out on my f-stop to f11, which is a higher number than I usually shoot at to get as many of them in focus as possible. While I also went out to 1 out of 2,500ths of a second of a shutter speed in order to freeze all of them in the frame. But because even though it was a sunny day, I upped my f-stop and I upped my ISO and my shutter speed, I had to increase my ISO in order to compensate for the darkness that these other two settings created. And with this whiskered screech owl, it was in almost pitch black darkness where I saw him. So to compensate for that, I had to go up on my ISO to a ridiculous 10,000. I left my f-stop at 6.3 since that's usually what I shoot at. And I left my shutter speed at a reasonable 1 out of 500ths of a second speed so that I could let more light into the photo, but at the same time, keep it so that if the owl moved quickly or flew away, I would still get at least minimal motion blur. And this owl did fly away just a second or two after I took this photo. It was just a really quick glimpse of him.
So focus is really important because if your image is out of focus, it's very difficult to fix in or impossible to fix in post-processing. There's two main methods of focusing. You can use your camera's autofocus system, or you can manually focus your lens. This is up to preference, but there are certain scenarios when uh, either method would be preferable.
And here I just want to emphasize the importance of focus. This white-eared hummingbird I took was in sharp focus, which allows us to see a lot of detail. You can see the feathers, feather markings, sharp eye, sharp bill, etc. But because he was in focus, I was allowed to work with the photo and enhance it a little bit more, just brighten up the colors a little and make it just look a little bit crisper. Whereas on the other hand, with this yellow-breasted chat photo I took, the bird was not in good focus. You can still see some feather detail, but the bird is just not in focus. It focused on somewhere else in the background. And even through post-processing, which we will get into later, I could not fix this photo because it is extremely hard, if not almost impossible, to fix bad focus in post-processing.
So I find autofocus preferable in most situations, but there are some situations where I think it's better to use manual focus. So in low light, the autofocus systems can have trouble determining where to focus. Um, Focus distractions. So for example, in this gnatcatcher image, there's a lot of foreground elements in front of the bird that I'm shooting through, and the autofocus was getting distracted by those. So in order to acquire focus on the bird, I had to manually focus my lens. Also, some low contrast situations, camera's autofocus systems can struggle.
And here we have autofocus. As mentioned, autofocus is typically faster, more accurate than manual focus, and can track subjects. It can be easier to use, but as previously mentioned, it can focus on the wrong thing. This photo of a lesser nighthawk I took, it just came out of nowhere from the sky in daylight in the morning. It was just flying right over as nighthawks do really fast. And because the autofocus was fast enough, I was able to get him in pretty good focus as he flew right by.
So field technique, we'll be going over a little bit how to use your settings and other techniques in the field. So there's different focus mode or different exposure modes. And for this image, I used aperture priority. So implementing field techniques, I highly recommend that you use the RAW format of images as opposed to JPEG. RAW just captures a lot more data in the photos and allows you to tweak them in post-processing. Um, Now, most cameras have different exposure modes. Um, so manual mode, for example, lets you control everything, and aperture priority only lets you control your f-stop and also exposure compensation, which is essentially how bright or dark you want your image to be. So you can plug in an exposure and choose your f-stop, and then it'll automatically choose your shutter speed and ISO if you want it to. Um, Shutter priority is the same, but the f-stop is chosen for you and you choose the shutter speed. And then manual mode lets you control both of those and ISO if you want, or you can have it on auto ISO. I usually use aperture priority for general type shooting while birding, just because the lighting conditions can change very quickly in that scenario. But if there's a uh, uh, situation where I need to more control over my settings, then I'll switch over into manual mode. And take a lot of pictures is recommended because birds move fast and cameras misfocus and stuff. So it'll give you a greater likelihood of getting a good photo.
And here are some more photography tips to think about when you're in the field. It's always good to take test shots and check your settings, as when you're in the field or if you were birding and photographing the day before, your settings may still be the same as when they were previously. So it's always good to take test shots and check your settings whenever you're in a new location so that you can adjust those settings to fit that new area. For birds in flight, it's usually good to use a fast shutter speed so that you can freeze them in the frame, as we mentioned. It's also good to shoot wide open or a lower F number for stationary targets, because then you'll be able to blur more of the background around them. For flock photos, it's good to go out on your f-stop and increase your shutter speed, so that way you can freeze them in the frame and get as many of them in focus as possible. And one thing we haven't mentioned here are two focus modes. There are usually two focus modes, one for stationary and moving targets, and these apply to autofocus, as one of them just focuses once and then locks the focus and doesn't refocus, so that's more for stationary targets. And then there's the other mode, which will focus on the subject, but will continuously refocus, and that's more for moving targets, so you could always have them in focus. And it's always good, as mentioned before, to check the focus limiter, because the focus limiter is how far away from your camera it focuses in. So there's usually one that focuses from the edge of your lens to a set distance from your lens. And then the other mode is from that distance onward as far as it can go. And checking the focus limiter is always important, because some birds may be in that distance close to your camera, which you'll have to adjust. And then the next bird may be outside of that distance, which you'll have to adjust to the other setting. And this photo of a reddish egret I got, and he was doing some really cool dance-like movements, and using these tips of focus limiter, fast shutter speed for moving targets, and shooting wide open so that I could get more of the water in blur, I was able to get this photo.
So ethical photography. We'll be going over a little bit about what to consider to make sure that your photos are taken ethically.
So ethical photography is very important, and we want to emphasize that a bird's well-being is always more important than any photo. So here are just some do's and don'ts of ethical photography. So do respect signs and shoot from a distance from the bird. Keep your distance from nesting individuals, And be aware of nervous behavior. Like if a bird's getting scared or nervous that you're getting too close, maybe slow down or stop until the bird kind of calms down and gets used to you. Don't flush the birds or trample their habitat. Don't trespass or feed or bait the birds. Don't use flash to photograph owls or any nocturnal birds. Don't crowd the birds. And don't use playback or pitching excessively. And don't use them for nesting individuals at all.
So generally with photography, getting closer to your bird will get you a better image. But it is always, when doing so, remember, uh, going back to the ethics slide, the bird's welfare is definitely far more important than the shot. But moving slowly, and patience can help you not disturb the bird and get reasonably close. Um, Learn bird movement patterns. You can often predict where they're going to go or what they're going to do. You can often put yourself in a position to let the bird come to you, in which case you won't disturb it. So predicting bird behavior is a really good skill to develop for bird photography. You can use your observations to sort of figure out what they're going to do, and this will allow you to, begin to capture behaviors and tell a story with your images, uh, put you in a position to get more intriguing images. So creative imagery, we'll be going now a bit about how to uh, make your images more interesting beyond basic documentation shots. Take your photos to the next level. So in this image, I used foreground blur to isolate the subject, making it a more interesting image. So lighting is one of the most important aspects of creating a pleasing image. Um, there is soft lighting and dramatic lighting, and all sorts of different types of lighting that we'll go over some examples that drastically change what the photo looks like. Mainly harsh light, like midday light, can be really not very pretty in images, and generally should be avoided, but a skilled photographer can work with it and make the most of it. So here's some examples of different types of lighting scenarios. On the left, we have a basic golden hour shot where as the sun is setting, the light becomes a really nice golden color. And then after the sun sets, the light will often become a more blue color and often pinks and purples of a sunset, which can create for some really interesting results.
And as previously mentioned, I often hear that midday lighting is bad for photography, but as we mentioned, a skilled photographer can work with it. This photo of a ruby crown kinglet I took on a sunny day where the sun was right above the bird and was shining down on the bird. And I adjusted my settings and played with my settings of my camera, and I was able to get this shot where the lighting's a little bit intense on the side over here, but it still was a good photo with decent lighting. And then this yellow crown night heron I took in morning light, and the morning I took this yellow crown night heron, it was really cloudy. There was even a light drizzle, and adjusting my settings again led to this photo where the yellow crown night heron was in decent light.
So here are some examples of how lighting can be used to create a more interesting effect. On the left, we have a silhouette image. This is wherever your bird is, it has to be darker than the background, where the light is coming from behind, and this can create some interesting results. Or on the right is much harder to achieve based on the situation. It's called sometimes a low-key type image, where the background goes completely black. And this is just because the background is so much darker than the bird. In this case, the background was completely in shadow, and the bird was being hit by direct sunlight. So then backlighting can create for some really interesting and dramatic images. On the left, we have I backlit this bird in midday light, so the light was really harsh, but I got the background to go dark because the background was in the shade and the light was passing through this bird's wings, which made for a really interesting effect. And then backlighting at sunset is a really nice effect because the light is so golden, and especially on I guess fluffier birds, it works especially well with young birds. It'll cause some rim light to appear along the edges, which can really accentuate the bird's shape. So perspective can really, really change the way an image looks. Especially with shorebirds and waterfowl, getting down low on their level will really make the images a lot more intimate, and also make your backgrounds blurrier and your foregrounds blurrier as well, because low perspective means that your focal plane will be perpendicular to the ground. Birds are also generally less scared of you when you're keeping a low profile.
And so now we'll be talking about composition next, which is mostly about how you position your bird and play with the point of view to make for an interesting image. I took this photo of an elegant trogon right after it had done a display flight, and it landed on this branch where I photographed it. And by moving my position, I was able to center him in the photo and create a creamier background with my settings, which created for a pleasing image. And also another example of lighting kind of here. You can see that the sun was behind the bird, but not directly behind, but it created some interesting rim light like effects on some of the feathers.
So composition is basically how you choose to make your image look and where you position your bird in the frame. So reposition yourself and your settings can make for some interesting effects. Something to not shy away from is having the bird small in the frame. It does take a bit more skill to make the bird stand out, but it can definitely work. And we'll go over the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is one of the most basic compositional techniques, but also one of the most effective. Offsetting the bird in the frame will make it a lot more interesting, especially putting it at the intersection points of these lines. It's also good to note that if you have a bird in profile or facing a certain direction, having them face across the frame so that they sort of have room to move across makes the image not feel as cut off. So here are some compositional examples. We have a tight portrait, and you can see that the bird is offset using the rule of thirds, looking across the frame. And in the right, we have a snowy plover that is facing head on the camera, which creates some nice symmetry. And so I place the bird in the middle of the frame to accentuate that symmetry. I should note that cropping in post can often help you achieve these compositions. So here's another example of symmetry in which I saw these two birds were sitting in a basically mirror type image pattern. So I waited for both of the birds to be looking up when I took this image. And on the right of this oyster catcher, I used a foreground rock to kind of surround the bird and make the rock that the bird was standing on less distracting. So I positioned myself into a place where that rock would be in front of the bird.
And now the final step is post-processing. I took this photo of a feisty little broad-billed hummingbird, And through post-processing, I was able to crop the photo a bit to bring him in and center him more. And I use tools of exposure and contrast, which we will go into, to brighten him up a little and make his colors just stand out a little more.
So enhancing and saving photos. It can really make your images a lot better. It's an important step in photography. Um, Generally speaking, it shouldn't drastically change the image. Often our cameras won't take it the way our eyes see it, and so you can basically restore that scene to the way your eyes saw it, um, and make the bird stand out a bit more. Um, it's somewhat controversial to what extent is acceptable. You know, some people would argue that it's an art and they can do whatever you want to the images. Um, Others would argue that if you're cloning out elements, you're ruining the integrity of the scene. So it's sort of up to personal choice and also situation, whether it's being used for scientific or artistic purposes. And there's various editing programs to choose for, which we'll go into.
So as we mentioned, there are many programs for post-processing, and one of the ones there is Lightroom, which we will talk about here as the one we use. Lightroom is a photo organizing and editing software, and its tools include the following, which is cropping, white balance adjusting, red eye, color saturation, contrast, intensifying colors. It can play with highlights and exposure. You can use the adjustment brush for selecting specific parts of your photo to edit. Um, Sharpening, and it has a little bit of noise reduction capabilities. You can also edit with the temperature and even turn your photos grayscale if you so please. So here's a screenshot of the Lightroom program. This is Lightroom Classic, and this is a photo of a California quail that I took. It's completely unedited, and you can see over here on the right that there is a number of settings and changes that Lightroom allows for, which is temperature and tint. You can play with the exposure and contrast of your photo. You can these are more exposure tools of highlights and shadows. You can edit the texture, clarity, and dehaze of your photo, which is more like a more intensive contrast. And up here, you have the histogram, which shows the settings you used for your photo. And the histogram will tell you where your settings and colors are in the color scale. So as you can see, this quail is a little bit dark, a little bit washed out. So it's more towards the left, which means that it's a little bit darker than the system would like. And these two triangle buttons over here will tell you that if your photo has places where it's so dark that there's no more detail, or photos where it's so bright that it lost all its detail as well. And with this little one on the left lighting up rather than this other one, that means that there are places in my photo where all detail has been lost because it's too dark. Lightroom contains other tools as well, as we mentioned, cropping and grayscale. So next is the completely edited version of the same photo. As you can see, I brought it in using cropping. I brightened it using the exposure tools. You can see on the right that they're all no longer at 0. I played with the highlights and the shadows to brighten up the quail and kind of blur the background a little bit more. I didn't want to brighten up the whole thing because then that would have made the background too bright, as in the previous image, the background was a little bit brighter than the quail itself. So I had to play with my settings so that I could get the bird mostly brightened, but not the background. You can see up here that the histogram is now more centered with a wider distribution of the color ranges. And that's mostly what you want when you're looking at photos through the histogram. And the two little triangle boxes aren't lighting up anymore. So that means that there's no places where it's so dark that I've lost all detail, or so bright that I've lost all detail. I've played a little bit with highlights and shadows, texture and clarity, and as I mentioned, cropping to bring it in. You can see on the left, there's even a history of all the all the changes I made, including cropping, exposure, even exporting it, and then changing it more as I wanted to do some things a little bit differently.
So Topaz Labs is a company that is creating artificial intelligence-based image editing software. The one I have is Denoise, which we'll show an example of. But they also have a sharpening program, Gigapixel, which is an upscaling program, and also a JPEG to RAW program. Can also serve as a plugin to other programs, so you can have it as a plugin for Lightroom. It's also some other similar products that other companies have developed. So this is what Topaz Denoise looks like, and it allows you to remove grain from images, and I think it does a really good job of it. You can see on the left-hand side, there's quite a bit of noise. It's especially prevalent in the background, whereas on the right-hand side, all that noise has been removed. Auto settings usually work pretty well, but sometimes I have to tweak them a bit.
Another program for post-processing, as we mentioned, is Topaz Sharpen AI. This program can enhance detail that is there. It unfortunately cannot restore detail that isn't there. You can see on the left, this is a photo of a buried bunting I took, and this is not a screenshot of the actual program. The actual program looks very similar, if not identical, to the Denoise program. But here you can see that this buried bunting, as I mentioned, the focus limiter, I accidentally had my focus limiter on the wrong setting. So this buried bunting that I took came out in the wrong focus because it focused on something in the back. But with Topaz Sharpen AI, I was able to not restore detail that isn't there, but enhance detail that is there. So you can see this isn't a photo that I put up on my wall or anything. It's not that great, but it definitely shows more detail and can be used for documentation shots or eBird lists.
So here's an example of a photo that I edited. As you can see, I shot it way too dark. And so I brightened it up in Lightroom in order to restore it to how I experienced it. I also did some selective edits. They're kind of subtle, but I did brighten up the bird a bit and darken down the rocks, just to draw your eye to the bird. And I think it's a much better image than the one that came straight out of the camera.
Here's another example of what post-processing can do, and another reason why you should shoot in RAW versus in JPEG. Because I took a photo of this red-tailed hawk on a branch in bright fog, and because I accidentally had my settings way too high from a different area where it was much darker, when I took the photo, it initially came out as this white box over here on the left. If you look really carefully, you can see just a very, very faint silhouette of the hawk and the branch, but it was mostly just a white box. But through post-processing and through Lightroom, I was able to end up with this photo because I reduced the exposure greatly, but at the same time, I brightened up the shadows so that the hawk and the branch would have some detail left. You can see some of the feathers on the hawk are still there. I played with contrast and denoise to kind of get rid of all the noise in the background. And then I used the dehaze function, which is, like I mentioned, a more intensive contrast. And that left with this interesting dust effect kind of all around the hawk. And because of that, that added a lot more noise into the photo. So I ran it through Denoise AI to get rid of all that noise, and then ran it once through Sharpen AI as the hawk had lost some noise from denoise. And so another example of what post-processing can do, I first started with this white box and then ended up with this hawk in the fog photo, which I wanted. And as I mentioned, this is just another reason why you shoot in RAW versus JPEG, because if this white box was just a JPEG photo, there would not have been enough data in there to restore it to what I wanted it to. JPEGs don't carry as much data as RAW do.
So, in conclusion, photography can be really fun and rewarding. Um, challenging your creative senses to make interesting images. Um, you can definitely do a lot. There's definitely a lot more information out there than could fit into this presentation. There's a lot of resources. I would recommend looking at other photographers' works for inspiration because there's a lot of really great photographers out there that can help you improve your photography. But ultimately, it comes down to practicing and getting out in the field, taking lots of photos. So have fun with it.
And as acknowledgements, we'd like to acknowledge Susan and Frank Gilliland for all your guidance and help with this presentation, Los Angeles Birders for your support, all the photographers out there who are taking amazing bird photos and sharing your passion with the world, and Western Field Ornithologists for the opportunity to present at this conference. And finally, thank you for attending.
Yeah. Any questions?
It looks like we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and stop your presentation so I can see you. And our first question comes from Lena. What editing software would you recommend for beginning bird photographer? And what is the cost of that software?
Well, there are many free post-processing softwares online, actually. There's many browser-based ones and then some free ones you can download right off the internet. It's probably best to do research on that subject because some programs have many more functions like Lightroom and can be hard to learn at first. And then some programs are just basic photo editors that are almost a little too easy. So it's really all up to personal preference, and there are a lot of processing sites available.
Um, a bit on that. Lightroom is it is expensive. It's over $100 a year subscription. Um, uh, but I don't think it's that hard to learn.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me see if there are any other questions. Oh, there's one more coming in. Tom and Carol ask, do any cell phones have image stabilization?
Um, yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the newer phones, especially, will have stabilization in them. Uh, I've found that like with binoculars, it can be really shaky, especially if you're only holding it with one hand for uh, digibinning. But I haven't tested it, but I'm sure that some of the stabilization in the newer phones would make that a more viable option.
I'm guessing a tripod would help a lot.
Any other questions?
It looks like we're done with the questions.
Actually, I have a question for you guys. Do you use exposure compensation very much, or do you leave that to post-processing?
Personally, I use exposure compensation a little bit, but I usually leave it towards post-processing, or usually I just play with the ISO and shutter speed and f-stop to try to brighten it in other ways.
Yeah, I use it a lot. Um, I mean, it's oftentimes there isn't time to adjust settings, or it is under or overexposed in camera, so then I'll do it in post-processing, but getting the settings right in camera will usually be less noisy than underexposing it in camera, because increasing exposure in post has the same effect as increasing ISO in camera. So if I'm using something like aperture priority, overexposing will usually drop my shutter speed a little bit and get me a cleaner image.
Great. Thanks, guys. That was an awesome presentation. I've learned a lot, and I have some things to explore further. I really appreciate this great overview. Our next event is going to be the members meeting. So I'll sign off and we'll take a break and hopefully see many of you at 3:30. Thanks again, you guys.
Thank you.